the Sahel is on fire. People are dying, terrorists is on rise. When you look at the global terrorist indicator, it's showing that countries like Burkina Faso or Sub-Saharan Africa are the epicenter of terrorism today. So what's going on? Why this area in Africa in less than 10 years become the epicenter of the terrorists? Who are those really engaged in the terrorists and why are they getting stronger and stronger? So to discuss this issue, we have with us Daniel Eizenga, a research fellow at the African Center for Strategic Studies. Could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your center and your work?
Sure, I'd be very glad to. Thank you very much for having me on your channel. This is a great opportunity, and I really think the work you're doing with this channel is so important for civic education, and just helping people better understand the different dynamics in our world today. And what's happening in the Sahel is a crucial example. And we try to talk about that at our center as well. So you mentioned I'm a research fellow at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. And, the Africa Center for its mission is really looking to improve security for all citizens through the strengthening of institutions in Africa. And we take security in that view, as sort of a very broad understanding of human security, looking at it from all levels, not just a defense perspective that's only focused on, the sort of hard security dynamics. We're looking at governance in the security sector, and how do you improve accountability and transparency within the security sector. But also we're looking at some of the hard dynamics too, like growing violent extremism across the continent. And we take Africa in its entirety. So we look at the entire continent, all 54 countries, and try to identify, the different security challenges that exist across the continent. What are cross-cutting challenges for many countries? What are specific challenges to some of the most populous areas? We're really trying to do it as broad as we can, in an effort to try and improve security for everyone.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's a little bit about our center.
Exactly. So I've seen that you've done a lot of work about Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and today we're going to focus mostly on the Central Sahel. Maybe next time we can discuss about other type of terrorism
Sure.
if necessary. So now you focus on the Sahel region. I've read one of the very interesting article that you published recently about what's going on there. For those who are listening and who don't know exactly what's happening in this region, tell us in few words what's really happening in Africa and Sahel region most importantly.
Yeah, thanks. So we've been tracking violent extremism, especially violent extremism that's been waged by militant Islamist groups on the continent for a long time. And we sort of identified four or five primary theaters where this is happening. So you mentioned Al-Shabaab in Somalia. There's also a Lake Chad Basin, which you see a couple other groups, and then you could look at Mozambique, northern Mozambique as another theater, or sometimes in the past, in particular, in parts of North Africa. But the Sahel, which, for the purposes of our conversation in this paper, we're really talking about three countries, primarily Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The Sahel has become the most lethal theater of militant Islamist violence in Africa for 4 years in a row now. And what I mean by most lethal is just simply that it's where the most people have been killed by acts of militant Islamist violence. It accounted for 55% of all such fatalities, all such deaths in the last year
Yeah.
on the continent. So more than half of the people killed by militant Islamist violence were killed in the Sahel region, primarily in those three countries, but also including a few other West African countries like Togo, Benin, and I believe in Côte d'Ivoire last year too. And so yeah, so that's why we've really focused in on the Sahel for these reports. We're trying to really get at where the epicenter of militant Islamist violence is located. Trying to understand that a bit better too. To throw another statistic in there,
Hmm.
Maybe I'll just add that 67% of all non-combatants, or you might say civilians, but all
Exactly.
non-combatants, meaning not fighters and so not soldiers,
Exactly.
67% or just over two-thirds of all non-combatants killed by militant Islamist groups in Africa were killed in the Sahel. So it's a threat that is really targeting civilians, even more so than soldiers or
Exactly.
in this particular region. Yeah.
This is a real threat. So now let's try to
Right.
understand now who are those perpetrating these attacks and killings. So we have different names in your article. You talk about JNIM, you talk about IS.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
try to break it down for us a little bit. Who are those groups and then why are they becoming very strong in this region?
Okay. Yeah, so this can get really confusing for people because there are a lot of different names and acronyms that
Exactly.
get thrown around. And unfortunately, in my perspective, something that happens because there are so many different groups is that in media reporting, there's a tendency to simplify. And so you'll see in a media report, they'll mention JNIM or JNIM, uh,
Exactly.
the Al Qaeda affiliate, right? And so they're just trying to condense it to what's the one group and who's it related to that the audience will know.
Exactly.
And that simplification, it kind of confuses the issue. It makes it harder to really understand what JNIM is and what it's trying to accomplish, who comprises JNIM. And so in some of the work we've done, we've really tried to dig into who are the local groups.
Exactly.
What are some of the other names that are attributed to those local groups? What are the differences in their motivations and objectives? Are there different ideological motivations? And we can talk more about that if you
Exactly.
like, as we discuss. But
Exactly.
um, to help people understand maybe how this works, so you mentioned JNIM and ISGS, or Islamic State Greater Sahara, sometimes now called Islamic State Sahel Province.
Mhm.
And that's kind of the two simplifications. But they each have smaller groups that make up those larger entities, right? And this is particularly the case for JNIM, which functions a little bit more like a coalition of different militant Islamist groups or different violent extremist organizations. And so within JNIM, you have Katiba Masina, or the Masina Liberation Front,
Mhm.
um, FLM, its French acronym. This is a group led by a Malian cleric, preacher, imam. I don't know that he necessarily should be given that title of respect, but it's one that he claims.
Mhm.
But that's Amadou Koufa. Amadou Koufa is the leader of Katiba Masina.
Exactly.
Um, and he's been involved in militant Islamist violence and trying to establish a caliphate in northern Mali since the early 2010s. And he kind of staked a claim over central Mali in about 2014, 2015, as the leader of Katiba Masina. He has organized Katiba Masina there. He's really entrenched within the different communities of that region, and he's been able to expand from central Mali into parts of northern Burkina Faso and into southern Mali now.
Mhm.
And that group poses a very real threat. It's probably the most active violent extremist organization in the entire region in terms of the number of events and the lethality of those events.
Mhm.
Um, Other groups that comprise JNIM would include Ansar Dine. This is a
Mhm.
group led by Iyad Gali, another Malian from northern Mali. And Iyad Gali has been around for a very long time too. At times, he's been aligned with ethno-separatist groups, Tuareg groups in northern Mali,
Mhm.
but he broke away from them and kind of struck out on his own to lead a more ideologically oriented group, an
Mhm.
extremist group. and he's considered the emir or the head of JNIM.
Okay.
He's also been involved in jihad or in this combat since the early 2010s.
And see, there are a lot of groups in this area, and one of the key question is where they're coming from. What do they want really? So this is
Yeah.
a very interesting question that many people are asking, right? Some people say the issue started after the assassination of Gaddafi. Different groups moved to this central Sahel. What do you say? What your studies show about where they are coming from and what do they really want?
Yeah, this is a really complicated subject, right? So, people often think of violent extremism and what are the push-pull factors, what are the drivers, the root causes. And they'll point to lots of explanations. And when you look at the Sahel region, often people will immediately say, well, it's got to be economic and its driver, right? This is one of the poorest regions in the world. Economic hardship and economic livelihoods come very, very difficultly here.
Mhm.
But that doesn't explain all of it, in my view.
Mhm.
You can look at other regions of the world that also have a lot of poverty, and you don't have the same degree of violent extremism going on. You may not have any violent extremism going on. And so I don't think that we can look at this as a purely economic or a purely a question of development and economic livelihood. I also don't think that it is a completely ideological element here. These groups, there are certainly members of these groups that are motivated by ideology. I already mentioned Amru Kufa, and he clearly has an ideological program in mind, and I'm sure that he has supporters that they adhere to a similar ideology.
Yeah.
Um, we see too in places like northern Mali, and with groups like Islamic State, Sahel Province, or Islamic State Greater Sahara, that they do have an ideological commitment. They are trying to implement and control populations with an extremist interpretation of Sharia law.
Mhm.
And so you do see that there are some elements of ideology out there, but again, it's such a small subset
Mhm.
of the overall population,
Yeah.
but also of what these groups seem to be trying to accomplish, that I'm not sure that that's the main driver.
Mhm.
There's also some really good research and evidence-based analysis done by the United Nations Development Program in a series of reports called Pathways to Extremism, I think.
Mhm.
And in that research, they've documented very well that one of the principal reasons that people join violent extremist organizations is because of a heavy-handed abuse at some point by the security forces.
Mhm.
And so some kind of heavy-handed abuse led by state actors that aggrieves population or grieves an individual toward the state can often lead them into recruitment. And we've seen this take place in the Sahel time and time again in the last few decades, where you had security forces really clamp down on particular populations, and that pushed people into these other groups for retribution or revenge. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's a multidimensional thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
We can't simplify it to, well, this is just poverty and underdevelopment.
Yeah.
We can't simplify it to everybody's been abused by security forces and thus they want to join up and take up arms against the state. And you can't simplify it into there's a deep and radical interpretation of Islam that has taken hold of a particular subset of the population and radicalized them. That's not the case either. It's a combination of all those different factors,
Exactly.
and for any one individual, it's going to look a little bit different.
Yeah.
And that means that you need a whole menu of different policy options to address it, right? Because
Exactly.
uh, to to get after that threat, you have to take a different approach for each one of those different causes.
And
Yeah.
this is very important because I've been recently there was a very interesting study by BBC where they tried to interview some people in Ghana who have been recruited by
Yeah.
these groups, and they were explaining that they've been joining that to retaliate, to take revenge because of what happened
Yeah.
to people. At the same time, some people also joining from Ghana people because they were young and then unemployed. So it joined what you've said. It's a multidimensional thing. So we need to look at different aspects of it. And so before we move to the next step, there is something that I want to have your feedback of it about those who
Yeah.
are involved in it. Many people, mostly in the Sahel region, they say that the most people, mainly in Burkina Faso, are the Fulani people, right? They say they are the Fulani people, that those
Right.
who are terrorists, and some people say no, they are not. It's mainly because they are living in an area where, unfortunately, the terrorism are spreading. So what do you say about it?
Yeah, it's a really important issue. There's the issue of Fulani stigmatization as a result of this conflict in the region, and there have always been tensions in the region with Fulani and other communities. It's a part of how Fulani live within society. This is an ethnic group that historically is a pastoralist ethnic group, and so they're kind of always on the move. And so many of their traditions and cultural practices and the ways that they integrate with other communities are a little bit different than those communities that are more sedentary. And at times there are disputes around that. These are your everyday kind of disputes, your tensions that emerge between different communities that have usually been resolved through social customs and practices relatively peacefully. Something like, a Fulani herd is moving through town and it tramples a field. Well, now you have a dispute between the farmers of that field and the herders of the livestock. And that dispute would usually have a set of mechanisms that could be resolved relatively peacefully between the leadership in the community and Fulani leadership that they would have some kind of a connection with. I'm speaking in really general terms here. Obviously, it's much more nuanced than that and would vary depending on where you are and what the customs were in that particular location. But all I'm trying to get at is that, the Fulani have been navigating those kinds of tensions for a very long time. But in recent years, with greater land pressure, larger populations, more and more sedentarization of pastoralist communities.
Yeah.
Many of these tensions have been exacerbated, and that has made it challenging for communities to resolve all of the different kinds of disputes.
Yeah.
And so, with that, the Fulani kind of become a target,
Okay.
in my view, and they've been that sort of combination of larger sort of structural things that are creating more and more social tension has been exploited by militant Islamist groups as a way to try and drive recruitment into their ranks. And so if you can, different militant Islamist groups have been able to identify where this tension is growing, then they insert themselves in the conflict. So they may inflame certain disputes between communities to cause conflict between Fulani and whichever other community happens to be there. And in inflaming that conflict, they then separate themselves and they say, look, we're going to establish order. So they use coercive force to calm the conflict, basically to enforce their own authority. And then they say, we're going to resolve the conflict. And so they make the conflict worse, and then they present themselves as the
Exactly.
solution to it.
Exactly.
And that in that way, they're exploiting it for their own ends. And that's really drawn a lot of Fulani into their ranks. Now, I want to make one nuanced caveat to that last comment there that there are a lot of Fulani in these militant Islamist groups.
Yeah.
It is true that there are a lot of Fulani in the militant Islamist groups, but the proportion of Fulani relative to the population is very small.
Exactly.
We're talking about thousands of individuals, not tens of thousands, much less hundreds of thousands. And there are many, many, many more Fulani in the entire region than
Exactly.
these thousands of individuals that have joined up. And it's the Fulani that are not joining that are being most negatively harmed by all of this stigmatization because
Exactly.
we've seen sometimes it's communal defense militias, sometimes it's state-sponsored militias, sometimes it's the state security forces or military themselves target Fulani communities, and at times engage in really just in mass atrocities. There's not really a better word for it. There have been massacres of Fulani communities. There's been extrajudicial killing of Fulani youth, all just because of the pretense that they might be linked somehow to these militant Islamist groups. And the vast majority of Fulani in the region are not linked to militant Islamist groups.
I think
Uh,
this is a very important thing that you raised
yeah,
right now. It's like when you look at the proportion of Fulani in the region and in as a ratio of those who are really involved in
yeah,
terrorists, it's really small. And also another interesting point that you use, which is also very interesting in terms of policy implication, is the fact that by repressing or targeting the majority of Fulani, the terrorists are using this as a new narrative, right? I was listening to
yeah,
one in the region. It was trying to frame themselves as protecting the
right,
communities against the government forces, while they are the one, as you just mentioned, who are making things worse, and then trying
right.
to show themselves and framing themselves. So meaning that government in this context has to be careful when they are trying to use a counter-terrorist measure. I think we're going to discuss a little bit about that next time. But now I would like to give voices, explain to people who are not living in country like in the Sahel region in Sub-Saharan Africa, to for you to try to let know how terrorism is really affecting the ordinary people in this country. And then exactly if you can really give us a little bit of detail. And then on top of that, to try to see whether you can understand the fact that military right now are governing this situation, because the goal is to protect the people with massive popular support. And as a response to that, and whether it has improved the situation or made it worse.
Yeah, so this is another really important but also very complicated set of issues. In terms of how the population has been affected, it's been, I think, very, very damaging. I mentioned earlier at the top that more than two-thirds of civilians killed in Africa by militant Islamist groups were killed in the Sahel region, and so you've just had loss of life in sort of the simplest metric that we could identify as clearly a huge loss and tragedy for the region. And we're talking about, to be clear, we're talking about thousands of non-combatants that have been killed by militant Islamist groups in the Sahel. So just, that's devastating in and of itself. Then you have the other effects. You have displacement. So I would do some quick mental math, but we're talking probably around 3 million people displaced from their homes and livelihoods
In
as a
the
result of
region
in the
country.
entire in the Sahel region in these three countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, as a result of militant Islamist violence, right? So the actual displacement figures are probably a bit larger. And if you were to take the entire region to include some of the coastal West African countries, then they would be a bit larger as well. Most of the displacement has been in Burkina Faso. We've seen more displacement because of violence in Burkina Faso than anywhere else. The official figures on that,
Before you
I don't,
continue on that point,
yeah.
explain why is it too stronger in Burkina Faso compared to other points?
Yeah, so the main reason is that in Burkina Faso, where violence has been most deeply entrenched, there's been larger population centers. And so you have more populous regions that have been affected by violence in Burkina Faso, causing more people to leave. Whereas where you've had violence entrenched in Mali, for example, there are fewer people living. So you might still see intense violence, but you have less people. You also have greater space.
Mm.
And so it's more challenging for militant Islamist groups to cover all of that territory to push people out of their communities. Whereas in Burkina Faso, you have communities that are more concentrated. And displacement has looked differently in Burkina Faso than it has in other contexts as well. We've seen that populations have really come together at sort of main urban centers. That's the main factor. As we've seen violence in Burkina become entrenched in northern Burkina Faso and in eastern Burkina Faso, with some growth in other areas as well.
Yeah,
Um, with displacement too, you have issues like the closure of schools.
exactly.
This is another huge factor in cost on the regular population. So I don't know what the figure is today, but it's been more than 4,000 schools that have had to close because of militant Islamist violence in Burkina Faso, several thousand in Mali, others in Western Niger as well. And that's because one of the main tactics for militant Islamist groups when they first come into an area is to target any institution, any official that is somehow linked to the government.
Yeah.
And so they do that as a way of undermining government authority. If they can run off government authorities, folks that are otherwise seen as being the authority in the region, then it's easier for them to coerce the rest of the population and to exert their own control without having to maintain a physical presence. That's led to millions of school-age children unable to attend school for multiple years. And so you're starting to see a generation of kids that has just missed out on years of education. So it's a huge cost.
Now
So
about
it's a devastating situation, I think, for the for
exactly.
the population.
Yeah, we've been seeing these recent days, and for example, in a study where we try to see how people feel about this kind of situation, we can see the
Yeah,
level of anxiety and stress among the population, and they are really desperate about the situation going
yeah,
on right now. And then we can see that even one of the reasons when for the coup that happened in Burkina Faso and Mali is because people felt like the current government wasn't doing really what was to be done to address the issue. And so now that we have different coups in the region, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and Niger right now, trying to address the issue, do you think that the situation has improved the condition in the area based on your study before and after, or do you think it had made it a little bit worse, or it might be a little bit complex?
yeah. So it is complex, but I think that in the most general sense, the outcome is pretty clear. There were coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and in Niger. In each case, the primary justification, the first justification of the coup leaders was the security situation.
Exactly.
And so you had military leaders oust civilian administrations that were democratically elected. With all of the flaws, with all of the warts and problems of those elections, they still had some claim to democratic legitimacy. But set all that aside for a minute, and the military leaders took power claiming that the security situation had been mismanaged by the civilian administration and that the military needed to intervene in order to right the situation. And now, so we're approaching 5 years since the first coup in Bamako, but we've also seen it'll be 3 years at the end of September that Ibrahim Traore took power in Ouagadougou, and it'll be in July 2 years since General Chiani took power in Niamey. So we've had multiple years now where these militaries have been in power, and if they were going to fix the situation, you'd expect it to have shown some progress. When we look at the empirical evidence, we look at the data, we see across the board that things have deteriorated, not improved. And not just deteriorated along the same trend line that they were deteriorating before the coups. So it's not a situation where if you took, 2 years before each coup and then looked at 2 years after that, it's been, maintaining the same trend. or that it might be deteriorating still, but it's deteriorating at a less rapid rate. No, it's the opposite. It's deteriorating at a much more rapid rate. And that's across the board by almost any metric in terms of the number of violent events or attacks by militant Islamist groups. It's deteriorated much more rapidly. In terms of the fatalities linked to those events, it's deteriorated much more rapidly. In terms of military losses, so number of ambushes, number of attacks on military bases, the number of soldiers killed in those attacks, things have gotten worse. We just mentioned Jibo a second ago, and I
Yes, I
think it was, yeah, there was a military attack on Jibo, or a militant Islamist group attack on Jibo about a little more than a week ago now, I guess.
yeah,
And from when we're talking, and that attack resulted in militant Islamist groups being able to overrun the entire city, take over the military base, loot materiel from that base. Perhaps hundreds of soldiers were killed in that attack, and they were able to maintain control over it for several hours before an effective counteroffensive could do anything to push them out. So we're seeing major attacks and victories by these militant Islamist groups, suggesting that the situation hasn't improved. In fact, militant Islamist groups may have improved their own capabilities
exactly.
during this time that the military has been in power.
Exactly.
Um,
So I would like to move a little bit to have a
sure.
look at that. In that question is more about they are improving. These are studies, and also your study and many other studies found that the Islamic group have been getting very stronger, well organized and well
Yeah.
structured. And also the different government says that these militant group have been backed, right? They have been backed by having international support and then where the weapon is coming. So we have a lot of discussion about what makes them stronger and then making them stronger to be able to control a vaster area. And in your report, even you show that they're also moving to cost, right? To the cost or like
Yeah.
high cost
Yeah.
places. So they're very more confident right now. We can see
Yeah.
what is the answer about first about with the different tactics of this terrorist group and then the new improvement in the way of working. The backing, where do they get all those weapons? Are they connected to different international organizations? What do you say about that?
Yeah. So I can answer some of it. I don't know if I'll be able to answer all of it. There's a
Yeah,
lot there.
yeah,
But in terms of the tactics, we've seen that the militant Islamist groups, in terms of their expansion, have different goals based on where they're expanding. But let me break it into sort of three main places. So you can look at expansion into southern Mali. That's a big area of expansion. It's being driven by Masina Liberation Front, or FLM, Katiba Masina, this group led by Amadou Koufa, from central Mali. And first, FLM expanded south into Burkina Faso, into a region called Boucle du Moun. And from there, they've been able to expand from central Mali and that part of Burkina Faso into southern Mali. So they set themselves up tactically to be, easy. It's easier for them to evade because it requires both militaries to coordinate whether they're going to be launching an offensive from Mali or from Burkina Faso. So they can move over that border relatively easily. They can target communities across that border relatively easily. And then from there, they can push into southern Mali, where you have a larger population, but you also have the different routes that are all feeding into the capital of Mali, Bamako. And so as they move into southern Mali, they're targeting those routes, and they do that primarily for revenue streams. It helps to reinforce their own organization to tap into more communities for recruits, for materiel, for trade, for just revenue,
yeah.
all those different forms of revenue. Okay. So that's the Southern Mali, and we've seen that they've really advanced in their capabilities. So it's worth noting this. It'll be 1 year in September since they attacked Bamako, and in an attack on Bamako, they were able to target an elite gendarmerie school in central Bamako. They were also able to set on fire the presidential plane at the airport. And so they were really able to take over in some ways key security infrastructure in the capital of Mali for several hours before an effective counteroffensive could be mounted against them there. And so they must, they've certainly grown in their capabilities in terms of what they're able to accomplish. It's the first attack on downtown Bamako like that, I think, I want to say since 2013. I could be off by a year or two there, but it's been many, many years since there's been an attack in downtown Bamako that way. Okay, that's southern Mali. And there are two other areas we're seeing some pretty intense expansion. One of them is in southwest Burkina Faso near the boundary with Côte d'Ivoire,
Okay. The
west.
Tija forest,
And
right?
yeah, exactly,
Tija
exactly.
forest, yeah.
Yeah. And so you have the Dita Forest area, you have growing expansion there, and you have a militantismist group that's operating there that's connected to Amadou Kufa, that's really tried to entrench itself. And an important part about this area is that you have a lot of commerce moving from the port in Abidjan north into Burkina Faso to Bobo Dioulasso and into Mali to Bamako. And so there's all kinds of smuggling and trafficking networks, as well as licit commercial transit and networks that these militantismist groups can disrupt, that they can try to exploit for their own revenue generation, that they can use to gain fuel, other materials, motorcycles. There's also a significant small arms trafficking in that region. And so you asked about, where are they getting all of their weapons? Some of it is from those kinds of networks. Another way that they're getting weapons is by overrunning military bases and taking the material from those military bases. There's also military bases in northern Burkina Faso, like that recent attack on Djibo.
Yeah.
You see that all the time, or ambushes on convoys on the route between urban centers. That's another very common way that they gather weapons and other material. The WAP Park complex is an area that it's a very vast area. It covers territory in Burkina Faso, Benin, and Niger, and it comes very close to the boundary with Togo as well as Ghana and Nigeria. And so you have this huge area there that they are able to use as safe haven. It's a protected parks space. And it's pretty dense forest. You can look at a satellite image of the area and you can immediately see where the area is protected and not protected just by the difference in vegetation.
Exactly.
Uh, and so they're able to exploit all those natural benefits. But they also are dealing with, again, another commercial transit corridor. And so you have goods that are being shipped into the ports at Lomé and Cotonou, and those goods then travel north through Togo or Benin towards Niamey or towards Ouagadougou. They cross the border into Burkina Faso or into Niger, and we've seen that the militantismist groups operating there are targeting those transit corridors, trying to control to some degree the flow of trade, but definitely integrating themselves into the smuggling and trafficking networks that operate tangentially right alongside the commercial transit. And all of that creates revenue generation for the broader set of groups in the region. It also lends itself to recruitment as people do. Some folks are motivated by economic opportunity, and some others are coerced into that situation.
Yes,
And so you see,
and in that context, is it true that these terrorist organization might have some collision with some crime organization facilitating this drugs like trafficking and smuggling and raising some taxes or
yes.
in the area?
That's absolutely right. And we've definitely seen that. We're seeing that they do collaborate. And in addition to just collaborating, they often are exploiting the situation to their benefit. Just like they exploit the social cleavages that exist between communities,
Yeah.
they're looking at the situation and they say, okay, here are these criminal networks, these smuggling and trafficking networks. They already are established and they are benefiting from a lack of security in the region. Well, we're going to make the region insecure for those groups, and
Hmm.
then we will insert ourselves as their protectors.
Yeah.
It's kind of a classic extortion type of model, right?
Yeah.
You identify a vulnerability, and then you you exploit that vulnerability, and then you present yourself as the solution to the problem that you created. And that's exactly what they do. So they may not actually engage in all that much smuggling or trafficking themselves, but they guarantee the smuggling and trafficking routes for the smugglers and the traffickers so that they can then take some of the revenue or take some of the goods from those groups. And oftentimes, due to government neglect in some cases, the communities in these sort of peripheral regions, they rely on the smuggling and the trafficking networks for their own livelihoods to a certain degree. And so you can't just rush in and shut down all of that transit, because then the communities they suffer. And when they suffer, you come in with those heavy-handed abuses, and so you push them into the arms of the violent extremist groups, the jihadists again. And so they've really kind of masterfully figured out how to exploit those different economic and political grievances that exist within these communities.
And this is a real complex situation for policing
Yes.
and mainly counter-terrorism policies in this context. Before we move to the next step and looking at the strategy, the recent attack in Togo and Benin, can they cross borders and Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana become also epicenter of terrorism in the region? What's the
Yeah,
risk?
I think there's a real risk there. Just by, you mentioned earlier that BBC report where they're talking with different Ghanaians that have joined
Yeah,
up. That in and of itself is a big flashing alarm in my mind. That's how things like this start. You have a few individuals that are motivated for whatever reasons to join up with these extremist groups. And that's how things get going. And once it spreads, then it becomes very difficult to stop if you don't have a strong, effective state response.
yeah,
Luckily in Ghana, there has been a response that isn't entirely driven by kind of a military-led approach. There have been efforts to try and refoster some of the dispute mechanisms between communities that should help to reestablish the social fabric between cleavages between communities. You've seen that the central government in Ghana has tried in a variety of different ways to get at local community-led initiatives by processes of representation. And so they've done things like establish a national peace council, which then has local chapters by region. And from the regional chapters, they then expand into the different local communities of their region, where they do things like have dialogues between law enforcement and other security forces and community leaders as a way of trying to bridge that gap, as opposed to the kinds of abuses that we've seen in other contexts that lead then to recruitment. So you've seen some really proactive measures taken by national authorities that have tried to come up with policies that can be adapted to their local contexts in northern Ghana. I think that that's going to be a point of resilience for northern Ghana. Um, and they've also dealt with some of the illicit activities, whether that be smuggling and trafficking, or whether that be artisanal gold mining, and the different ways that that can be used by criminal actors, but also support communities. We've seen the Ghanaian authorities take approaches that try to dismantle some of the criminal activity, but do so in ways that then are backfilled by policies that can help the communities to keep their livelihoods going. So education programs, employment programs, ways of targeting those populations that would be most vulnerable to that kind of disruption. We've seen similar things in Côte d'Ivoire, where there has been a need for a greater security response because there have been more violent events in Côte d'Ivoire than there have been in Ghana. So we have seen many instances. I think it's only been a few dozen in the last few years in northern Côte d'Ivoire where that militant Islamist group in the Dita Forest has pushed over into the border and attacked the security forces primarily in Côte d'Ivoire.
mm,
That's resulted in a greater security response. But we've also seen in Côte d'Ivoire that as they've mounted that greater security response, they've gone to great lengths to make sure that they do so with community intervention as well. And so instead of going after the Fulani population in northern Côte d'Ivoire and stigmatizing that population more, they've tried to work really closely with community leaders to better understand their environment, gather better intelligence for their own security operations, but also understand the needs of the communities that are there. And the state, again, has come to northern Côte d'Ivoire to engage with some of those basic needs requirements. So we've seen infrastructure programs, we've seen unemployment programs, which have there's a program that looks like it's working very well that's involved internships in some kind of trades skill for youth that then result in a small loan that helps them to get some kind of business off of the ground, and it can be repaid over a very long period of time. And as a way, you're trying to build some of the social capital and establish livelihoods that are not linked to criminality, not linked to extremism in northern Côte d'Ivoire. And compared to places like Togo and Benin, where we haven't seen as much of that programming, we're seeing that there's significantly less entrenchment on the part of militant Islamist groups in Côte d'Ivoire. There are fewer violent events, there seem to be fewer recruits, and it's a pretty similar context. In Togo and Benin, there's been a more heavy-handed approach to trying to deal with this. We're seeing the Beninois government make a subtle change in its policy direction, but they've been very disruptive in some of the livelihoods that they've tried to address. So they tried to establish a sedentarization program, or a sort of ranching program for pastoralists in Benin, and this really destabilized relations between farmers and herders in that context. In fact, that sedentarization program, I think, resulted in more farmers getting land that they could use for livestock than it did in pastoralists getting the land that they needed for the herds that they already had. And that really just sort of made for a very imbalanced situation that created greater tensions that militant Islamist groups then exploited, right? And we've seen that play out in other contexts that we described before, like Central Mali, Northern Burkina Faso. And so the government in Benin is having to make adjustments to try and resolve some of these things that it kind of messed up the first time with its own policy decisions. So
Yeah,
all that to say, it's a really complicated and difficult process, and we've seen some governments respond to it better than others. And the key thing seems to be connecting the security forces with the populations that they serve.
yeah,
When you have a security forces detachment, whether it be military or law enforcement, it could be national police like the gendarme. If they're in an area and they understand their communities, they have strong relationships with community leaders, then they're going to be able to de-escalate a situation, and they're going to have a better understanding of the dynamics and as a result, provide security, the service that they provide to their communities better. And so where that's happened, we've seen more resilience from these militant Islamist groups as they push further and further south.
exactly. And this is really interesting, showing the different experience of countries like Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire in
Yeah.
addressing the root cause of terrorism, right? And how why some countries, by trying to put more emphasis of social prejudice and stuff, are worsening the situation. This is really interesting. Now we are going to try to sum up what we've done and then try to, because time flies very fast, right?
Yeah.
But now the key is here now. I would like to see whether you can give your thought, a bigger picture about what is going on. But I would like you to do like in comparison to like what's happening in Al-Shabaab, right? Or Boko Haram, because I know you studied it and they are long history, more than 20 years of Al-Shabaab, right? So
Yeah.
comparing to what is happening in the Sahel region. So looking at the experience of how Al-Shabaab become stronger, implement themselves in this region, what might be to the lessons we can learn from that, and how what should we avoid in order to address the issue before it become a bigger issue and become like 20 years, 30 years terrorism in the region.
Yeah, so I think, if I had to be, I'll try to be brief. And I think that the biggest worry I have when I think about, comparisons between a place like Somalia and Al-Shabaab, what's happened there with the, effective entrenchment of Al-Shabaab into parts of Somalia where they are the de facto governing authority, and the Sahel. Right now in the Sahel, there's sometimes discussion over territorial control, and you'll hear different percentages thrown around about how much territory the state functionally controls versus militant Islamist groups. And I think that the real risk right now is, if things stay in the kind of status quo, that you're going to have a situation where the state may control certain key routes and certain population centers along those routes, but it will not be able to control much of the countryside. And that's going to put all kinds of different pressures on the population. And that situation could be one that sort of stalls into a status quo for a long period of time. I think that's one risk. I think a worse possible outcome for the Sahel is one where we see government collapse. There's a lot of, I'm just going to call it propaganda, but there's a lot of media, whether it be social media or news media, that's being pumped out by the different juntas that are in power right now in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, because they staked their claim to legitimacy on improving the security situation, and they've failed so far. And so as a result, they need to present themselves as winning in order to remain popular and not collapse. But when you have the losses that they're experiencing on the battlefield, you lose internal support within the military itself, and that can lead to an incoherence. And it can lead to essentially a fragmentation within the military, which makes it as an institution far less capable and weaker. And so then it becomes more susceptible to attacks by these militant Islamist groups, but also to things like an internal coup or dispute. And so I'm not predicting that that will happen necessarily, but I think that the risk for it is really there. If that were to happen, then I think you could really see something much more similar to Somalia play out in the Sahel in one context or another, because in the wake of a government collapse, in the wake of a military collapse, there would be much broader insecurity in the region, I think. And so I worry a lot about that risk. Um, for me, the way out of that, the way to avoid some of those potential risks or outcomes, is really to try and activate a civilian response here. And that doesn't mean civilian only. I think obviously the security situation in the region is very serious. And so you're going to need some sort of military response, and you'll need the military to be engaged in any kind of future governance. But I think that the current trajectory of the juntas in power has kind of been shown that it's only going to get worse. So you need to redirect the ship. And I think that if you could work with some of the civilian groups that have a little bit broader legitimacy, then you might be able to better understand some of the needs of the communities that have been most affected by this. And that may be a good place to start to push back against some of the things that militant Islamist groups have been able to exploit. And with that, then I think you'd be able to begin providing security for those communities in ways that are currently not the case. And that involves things like limiting the stigmatization of the Fulani population, so that you don't have an increase of those tensions and a continual tearing of that social fabric, and instead you have a repatching of the social fabric that existed before. I think that's gonna, in the long term, that's really what's needed, but I don't think that the military has the capacities for understanding what policies will put that kind of repatching of the fabric back in place. And so you have to activate some of the civilian leaders that have broader popular legitimacy and can speak representatively for the broader population. And I think that's the best way to try and remain resilient from this threat, in my opinion.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Daniel. And that was a very interesting discussion about what's happening. I hope now that most of us we better understand what terrorist is, who are those who are in the Central Sahel, and then why they are getting stronger. As you just mentioned, they have been exploiting source of grievance, the weaknesses of the states to try to become very strong. Where the money come from, but by controlling the main roads, collaborating with criminal organization in the area to get the money, and also attacking these military or militaries to get the weapons and all the stuff from them. Why in countries like Ivory Coast and Ghana is better because they've been addressing the root cause of the conflict, though there is still a high risk of the state also becoming like Burkina Faso and Mali. But at the same time, there is still hope because the country is not at the level of Al-Shabaab in Somalia. We can still turn this trend around by addressing the root cause, having a very clear policy that's going to work with civil society in the grassroots, try to mobilize the population, to try to work together with the military and the different states to avoid stigmatizations, and then to try to counter these extreme narratives and not give room for those terrorists who are going to make things worse come and frame things in their own advantage as if they are there to protect the people while they are the one who created the problem. So I think based on this understanding, I think we can now try to see how we can help our government, push the government to have better policies that's going to address the issue in the region. If you don't have anything to add, I would say thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was I could not have summed it up better myself. So I'm really pleased. Thank you so much for having me. And absolutely, I'd love to come back another time. And I hope that this will be informative and useful to your viewers.
Thank you very much. Thank you.